All right, good evening, everybody, and welcome to Carving It Up Live right here on YouTube, as well as on Facebook, on Twitch, on X, and on Instagram. I am Bryson Carver. It is great to be with you today, and, we've got a little bit of a different show today. Not that much different from the usual. We've got plenty of sports to talk about, as we normally do. Tyreek Hill got released by the Miami Dolphins. What will the market look like for him moving forward? Get to that. LeBron James, he had a press conference yesterday, kind of shot down any rumors of, any immediate retirement announcements. Why I think it's a foregone conclusion. He's going back to Cleveland next year, going to play one final season in year 24 before retiring in 2027. Also get to an announcement that Steph Curry made yesterday that some of the greatest shooters ever will be competing in the NBA three-point contest next year in Phoenix 2027. Get to that. And at the end of the show, the thing I'm very, very excited for. So today's President's Day, and for those that have watched this show for any length of time, a lot of you might know I am a lifelong fan of presidential history, even longer, hand to God, even longer than I've been a fan of sports. So what we're going to be doing is like a sort of bullet point, rundown, I guess, so to speak, or fun facts about each of the 47 presidents of the United States. So I hope you'll stay tuned for that at about 6:40, 6:45 later on today's show. So very excited to get to that. But we got to start, of course, with a shockingly pretty good All-Star game. Let's get to it. But first, I'm not going to lie to you guys. I was expecting all throughout this past weekend, and coming into tonight's show, thinking, oh boy, here we go. This is like the fourth year in a row I'm going to have to come in, talk about what people overreacting to the All-Star game, about it not being that much of a watchable product, because frankly, I don't think folks care that much about a good All-Star game. But when it was all said and done,
not so fast, my friends.
Pretty darn good in Los Angeles. So Adam Silver obviously changed the format last year, and we had suggested on this show in the past, I think back in 2023 and in 2024, making it a Team USA versus Team World type of situation. Adam Silver kind of made a format that mirrored that. It was kind of like a double elimination tournament type of deal. And as it turns out, matter of fact, the ratings just came out minutes before we went live today. 8.8 million views, which is the most watched All-Star game in 15 years, in 2011. So obviously people enjoyed it. There was certainly wasn't a full speed game 7 or even like a regular season game in mid-February that we saw in the All-Star game in LA last night. But listen, Wemby was competing, and Edwards, who won MVP, he was going out there doing his thing. Kawhi Leonard was in fuego in the second to last game of the All-Star tournament. Yesterday, I think he dropped like 31 points in that 12-minute span, and it was a passable product. It looked like basketball. I won't go so far as to say as it looked like me and you and all of our buddies competing at the Y necessarily. Again, it didn't even look like that much of a regular season game. The NBA guys weren't just like going at each other's throats for the entire duration of the tournament. But there was an element of, this is not bad. This isn't just guys kind of half walking up the floor, jacking threes. No, listen, there are still some guys that really don't care that much for the All-Star game. Nikola Jokic, who, by the way, I still think he's the best player in the world. Jokic really doesn't give two craps about the All-Star game. We've seen guys in the past. We've seen Steph Curry just say, I'm just going to jack 33s. You know what? Steve Kerr gives me the green light all the time. Not this kind of green light. Steph obviously didn't play last night because he's got, runner's knee. Giannis was injured. Luka was injured. So there were some marquee stars that were out for this game. But by and large, not the guys that were out there competing. Kevin Durant struggled a little bit. I think Katie's got some stuff off the court and on social media to worry about more than basketball. I digress. But it was fun. I'm not going to lie. I'm going to start a conspiracy. And listen, maybe this is me being a hypocrite, because I detest conspiracy theories in every way, shape, and form. I think if you do not know something or have justifiable reason to believe something, don't claim it as fact. Don't claim it as fact, I should say. However, it is President's Day. And again, we're going to do a President's Day segment in about 40 minutes. But I was thinking, you saw President Obama and his wife, First Lady Michelle Obama, sitting courtside at the game. You remember when Obama went on Tyrese Halliburton's podcast and was kind of railing on him. He's like, man, y'all got to have some pride in that All-Star game, man. Back in the days, in Obama, respect to the president, was starting to sound like a little bit of an old head. Isaiah Thomas and Michael Jordan, Bird and all these guys, and they just went all out in the All-Star game. It was like, I went back and watched. They did, but it wasn't like they were treating it like a game 7. This wasn't just like going at each other's necks. for 48 minutes. But he was kind of ripping Tyreek. He's like, hey guys, let's have some more pride in the All-Star game. I don't know if Adam Silver invited the former president for to maybe speak to the guys in the locker room. We know Obama has a very tight relationship with the NBA. He was actually with Team USA in the early stage, or I guess the late stages of their training camp before they went to Paris at the Olympics in 2024. He's got relationships with LeBron and Steph, and his interactions with Ann Edwards are always kind of funny. I'm going to go on a limb and say, I think the former president, went in the locker room, talked to especially the Team USA guys, and maybe even the World guys, because Wemby was kind of the guy who set the tone, obviously playing for Team World, being from France, and kind of spoke to those guys like, we're in Los Angeles. It's a nationally televised game. All-Star game's been bad really since 2022 was the last decent All-Star game when Steph hit like 16 threes and Bron hit the game winner. It's been bad for years. Like we've got to, be able to put on a good show for the fans. And while I have argued on this show the last few years in regards to the All-Star game, in that I think this I'm be honest and call it what it is, fake outrage when the All-Star game is just awful, when it looks like, frankly, the way the Pro Bowl has looked since the Pro Bowl has become a flag football game, even before that, where it was barely even a two-hand touch type of football game, where it's, guys, current NBA players do not need the All-Star game. Guys in the 80s did, 90s did, early 2000s. They needed the All-Star game for marketing, shoe sales, commercials. I mean, if you were in the slam dunk contest and you did something no one's ever seen before, if you were Jordan, or if you were somebody like Dominique Wilkins, or like a Kenny the Jet Smith, who won an All-Star game back in the day, or if you're a role player as recently as 2016, like they were role players at the time, Aaron Gordon and Zach LaVine, it can change your legacy. It can change your image. You become a star over the weekend. Look what it's done for Mac McClung financially. Mac McClung, that's the only thing he's famous for. And that goes back to high school, by the way. What he did back in his high school days at Gate City, holy crap. Like, that's what Matt McClung's famous for. Guys don't need it anymore. And I know the popular thing today is to go on television and blame LeBron James for not caring about the game enough because he's scared to do an All-Star game, when LeBron James, scared is not exactly the word I'd use for him, given the fact that I think he's got one of the highest averages in terms of points in Game 7s all time. I think LeBron's not scared of the big moment, especially a dunk contest. Regardless, this is not a weekend that in 2026 is really all that mandatory for the players. And let's be honest, for athletes, for any of us, if there's not some sort of incentive, be it financial or otherwise, are we really as inspired to do it? You can call it right or wrong, but that's the reality. If you impose today's players back in the 80s, yeah, they're going all out in the All-Star game. And you superimpose the 80s players to today, I guess prior to yesterday, maybe it was a patriotic thing. Maybe it was a Team USA versus World thing. It brought out a different level of competitive fervor in these players. Like, hey, we Team USA's heard for years, and it's true, the world's caught up to us. See last year's Olympics in the last 2 rounds. Let's show the world. Let's show Wemby and Jokic. Jokic doesn't really care. Let's show Wemby and Shai Gilgeous-Alexander and all these superstars. No, this is still, at least right now, it's still an American game. Even though basketball was technically invented by Canadian, but regardless, it's still an American game. Maybe that's what played into it. But regardless, I thought it was a fun night. I thought it was far more competitive than any of us thought that it would be. Ann Edwards won MVP. Again, one of the young American stars. There's this pressure on Ann Edwards, and I've kind of railed against on my show. It's one thing to have pressure to say, hey, you're a young star player. We expect you to eventually become an MVP candidate, to lead the Timberwolves to a championship or two. That's one thing. That's always been the case for superstars in the league, which Ann Edwards obviously is. It's another like, you know what, man? You remind me of Michael Jordan. Heck, you kind of look like Jordan. Your game is similar to MJ. You're a better three-point shooter, but it's an aerial type of game. Solid minutes, get to the basket, play your butt off on the defensive end. Like, you remind me of MJ a little bit. To which Ann Edwards and even Michael Jordan, I think, have come out and said, let the kid be his own guy. Let Ann Edwards be Ann Edwards. And so, listen, I know so much of the basketball discourse for the last really since Jordan retired. The time Jordan retired for the final time in 2003 and Braun came in the league around the same time. I know it is, you have to relive and get that special tingly feeling that number 23 in Chicago gave you when you were either a kid or when you were a local team beat reporter coming up in the business at the time NJ superstardom was going on. And if somebody, be it Braun, Steph, KD, any of these guys, don't give you that tingly feeling that they're just never going to be in the same universe as Michael, that's how a lot, and that's a whole different discussion, how the basketball discourse has, I think, become polluted over time. But as for last night, listen, I got issues with Adam Silver, number one of which being the current CBA, which basically prevents dynasties, which I despise. Dynasties have carried the NBA its entire history. The NBA is at its least popular when there aren't dynasties. But people have been calling for changes for years. He experimented with the All-Star draft, which I didn't hate, by the way. I think it was kind of fun to have the top two vote getters in both conferences draft their own teams. Like it was a pick-em, or a pick-up basketball type of feel. I thought that was cool. Got rid of that. Went back to East-West. They should have never done that. They tried the Kobe Bryant rules with the fourth quarter. Like, at least for this year. Maybe it's just national pride. Whatever it is. Guys cared. From the youngest guys like Wemby to the old guys like LeBron. They cared. And so yesterday was a good day for the NBA. And so, and kudos to Ann Edwards. I thought Kawhi Leonard was going to be a shoo-in to end up winning, but I think he kind of ran out of gas. That whole team ran out of gas in the final game. But Ann Edwards was fantastic last night in the All-Star game. But I did want to shift, though. It's our only NFL topic. And again, there's going to be months of speculation and discussion around the draft. The combine's coming up, I think, in a couple of weeks, and draft measurements or measurabilities, all these different things. We're going to get into that. I'm going to do some mock. Last year's the first year I did mock drafts. I had a blast doing it. Going to bring back Bryson's mock drafts this offseason over the next couple of months, so stay tuned for that. As far as offseason moves, a couple of dominoes have already fallen, such as Tyreek Hill being released by the Miami Dolphins today, which saves them, I think, about $22 million of cap space. So listen, Tyreek Hill's 31 years old. He's just completed his 10th year in the NFL. His 10th year didn't last very long because he got hurt late in September. And I think according to Tyreek himself, he could not walk without assistance until last week. So I know it's February. I don't anticipate him. It's one thing I don't expect him to go from just now walking in mid-February to playing 100 miles an hour, playing like the classic cheetah Tyreek Hill that we all have grown to know and watch this September. My guess is he's probably back at some point in mid to late October. Like, I do not think Tyreek Hill, maybe I'm wrong, I don't think he's getting picked up by a team until at earliest training camp for a number of reasons. Number one, he's a receiver in his 30s. That's receivers and running backs don't tend to age that well. Running backs especially, but receivers, again, there are exceptions to the rule, but by and large, you kind of fall off once you hit 32, 33 years old. That's usually how it goes for most positions, really outside of quarterback. That's number one. Number two, there's obviously some drama that comes with Tyreek Hill. There's some off-field drama we won't get into that is part of the baggage if you bring Tyreek Hill into your organization that you have to deal with. And there's also the element of, if you're talking about, forget the off-field stuff, which is its own separate issue. If you're talking about what we've known over time as the diva wide receiver, so to speak. Sorry, my voice cracked there. Diva wide receiver, so to speak. I think we've seen over time that doesn't really impact your ability to win at the highest level, positively or negatively. In fact, I mean, Kansas City Chiefs look no further than them. They literally traded Tyreek in the heart of his prime. By the way, Tyreek's first year in Miami, he has nearly 1,800 receiving yards. And Kansas City wins his second year in Miami, he had 1,800 receiving yards. And Kansas City wins back-to-back Super Bowls and then goes to another one. Why? Because they have Mahomes and Andy Reid. Was it as if they had this just special wide receiving core? It was, no, Travis Kelce last year was prime in 2022. He had a great playoff run in 23. And that's basically it. It was Juju Smith-Schuster, and it was Sky Moore, and it was Valdez. I mean, it was kind of a Tom Brady-esque, like working with a lot of guys, a lot of Jags, just a guy. But the infrastructure, Kansas City, Mahomes, Reed, great GM, clutch playoff tight end, opportunistic defense. They went to Super Bowls with Tyreek, won a Super Bowl with Tyreek. They won 2 the second he left. Mahomes won an MVP the season post Tyreek trade. And so I'll be honest, man, I don't expect his market to be off the charts. I'm sure there are some Chiefs fans that are like, hey, let's bring him back. I wouldn't even necessarily be against that because it's a low-risk, high-reward type of situation. Obviously, we'll see when Mahomes comes back from the ACL. I'm not even sure if he's going to be available for week 1. We'll see whether Kelsey comes back. At this point, if I had to guess, I think Kelsey comes back at this particular juncture in time. Maybe I'm wrong. My guess is he probably comes back for one more year, then retires. The Kansas City's got plenty of issues up front of their offensive line, particularly in the interior. Now, some of that is Creed Humphrey, Trey Smith dealt with injuries. Hopefully they're up, especially Trey Smith. Hopefully they're back healthy. Your wide receiving core is limited, but you could probably get maybe slightly less production than you would get from Tyreek Hill in 2026. Maybe more because he's coming off a devastating injury from a guy in the 4th or 5th round. Wide receiver historically has been the easiest position to draft. It always is. I mean, Jerry Rice was not a top pick in the draft. Neither was, guys like Antonio Brown. I think Antonio Brown was like a 5th or 6th round pick. Puka Nacua, late round pick. Like, you don't have to necessarily be a Justin Jefferson or Jamar Chase or Jackson Smith-Njigba, a first-round guy to pop. It usually helps, but it's not a given. So I think if you're looking at, if you're looking at the Kansas City Chiefs, you're looking at a team that has plenty of issues, and I don't think Tyreek Hill necessarily fixes those. And if you look up and down the list, you look at contenders throughout the National Football League. I know the Patriots are potentially going after, A.J. Brown, which I think would be a better fit because he's a better player than Tyreek Hill at this point. He's more physically gifted. A.J. Brown has been a good soldier when he first gets to a destination, Tennessee, Philadelphia. It kind of, disintegrates over time. But I think A.J. Brown would be a good move for New England over Tyreek Hill. Younger, more physically gifted, better route runner at this stage of his career. And again, none of this change. If Tyreek Hill says, you know what? Too many injuries, off-field distractions, didn't like how my time in Miami ended. I'm just going to retire. I'm going to retire. There's an argument he's a first ballot Hall of Famer. A legitimate argument. You're talking about a Super Bowl champion, multi-time first-team All-Pro, 8-time Pro Bowler. Like, that's a Hall of Fame type of resume. Big aspect for me, and this is why I defended Luke Kuechly getting in. His second opportunity in the Hall of Fame, Hall of Fame is if you are in the argument at any point of your career as the best player at your position for any extended period of time and you have the long-term accolades, I've got to put you in. I do. So Tyreek's going to get in, whether it's first ballot or not. That'll be determined over time. I think there's no question he's going to get in. As for his market, though, in 2026, the Seattle Seahawks just won a Super Bowl with arguably, he's in the argument for best receiver in the league, Jackson Smith-Njigba. Low maintenance. Great teammate. Works well with Sam Darnold. No drama. Philadelphia's got a guy as talented as JSN and A.J. Brown. Can't wait to get him out of the building. If Tyreek Hill, yes, there's a financial component to it. Yes, there's we're just going to rebuild. They already released Bradley Chubb. They released Tyreek Hill. The chances are they probably attach a pick and get rid of Tua. Jeff Hafley's coming in. They're trying to, Troy Aikman's involved with the organization. They're trying to rebuild a new culture in Miami. They feel that moving on from Tyreek Hill from a financial and a cultural standpoint gives them a better chance to be competitive again. Because of the injury and the drama, both on and off field, my guess is Tyreek is probably not signed until training camp, or maybe right before. So we'll see. All right, gonna take a break. When we come back, LeBron James had a press conference yesterday before the All-Star game. And I gotta say, after watching it, I think he's coming back for another year. As for another legend who's at the end stage of their career, my guy Steph Curry, he revealed something very, very exciting on NBC yesterday, pregame, that I'll talk about. And at the end of the show, in about 20 to 25 minutes or so, very, very excited. It is President's Day. And as you guys know, I have been invested in presidential history even longer than I have been sports. And so we're going to give like a quick fun fact sort of thing for each of the 47 presidents of the United States. You're going to want to stay tuned for that. But first, we're going to take a 1-minute break here on Carving Up Live. Don't go anywhere, folks. We will be right back. Welcome back to Carving Up Live. Appreciate everybody for stopping by on a Monday. I apologize for my hoarse voice today. I may chalk it up to the fact, I'll be honest, I haven't talked that much today. You know, reading, doing schoolwork, working out. I haven't really talked that much today, so maybe I didn't warm up my voice enough for the show. So, you know, lesson for future episodes. But I apologize for the compromised voice today. Hopefully be able to still give you a good show. I did want to talk about LeBron James because he did a press conference yesterday and shot down any sort of rumors. I don't want to say shot him down necessarily. Shot down any idea that he's going to make a split-second decision right now about this being his final season in the NBA. And you can interpret that any way you want. The way I looked at it, he's playing one more year. He's going to be a free agent this summer. I think the article that came out by ESPN a few weeks ago that we discussed on the show about the fissures between he and Jeannie Buss, and Jeannie viewed him as a savior of the franchise, which he quite literally was. You were in the gutter, and then by year 2 of LeBron being there, he won a championship. I digress. That relationship is coming to an end this summer, I think. It's not because LeBron doesn't like JJ Redick. We know his relationship with JJ before JJ was coaching the Lakers. Luka get along great. I think it's the Lakers need to build around Luka. Whether Pelinka's capable of doing that, got my doubts. And LeBron's going to say, I want to be able to finish one more year where I want to play. And there have been reports that, hey, the Warriors could be a possibility. We know about Steph and LeBron's relationship. We'll get into Steph Curry in a few minutes. Steph and LeBron are close the whole bit. We understand that. I would not, certainly as a Warriors fan, I'd love to have LeBron for a sort of last dance type of thing. Steph will be 38 and going on 39. It might be Draymond's final year. Jimmy Butler coming back from an ACL, like one last old man push. What the heck? Might as well. I'd love if LeBron came. I don't think he will. There's some rumors he goes to the Knicks. I don't think the fit makes all that sense, but we'll see. He's going back to Cleveland. I mean, you saw him a couple of weeks ago. Makes his annual, because he plays in the Western Conference. Cleveland's in the East. They only play one game a year at each other's cities. He's playing at Cleveland at the Rocket Arena or whatever it's called in Cleveland, Ohio. They play the tribute video, which they do every year when LeBron comes back. But this go around, like, he's visibly emotional. He's got hand in palm, wiping tears, and there was some speculating, hey, does this mean this is it for LeBron? I think in that moment, there was, and I don't think LeBron knows if he's coming back next year. I don't think. But just as a speculation, what if it was I know I'm coming back. The next time I play in this arena, it's going to be, I'm going to know this is going to be my last season in the NBA. And listen, LeBron, and he's caught flack for this, the decision most notably, LeBron likes the spotlight. That's putting it mildly. I think LeBron James, of all people, isn't going to want a retirement tour. By the way, a deserved retirement tour. Jordan got it. Kobe got it. Kevin Garnett, got it. Paul Pierce got it. Paul Pierce can get a retirement tour. LeBron James can get a retirement tour. Dirk got a retirement tour. Dwayne Wade. I think LeBron will want that appreciation from other fan bases, which he's richly deserved. No question about it. He's played longer than anybody. He's put more blood, sweat, and tears than any player in the history of the game into the league. I think it's only fitting he does it in his hometown city. I think it's only fitting he does it as a Cleveland Cavalier. And by the way, again, the idea that he would sit with the Lakers or go to Golden State. Listen, the West is always the better conference. But next year, Wemby's a year older. The Spurs as a whole are a year older. Oklahoma City's not going anywhere. Houston, Amin Thompson gets better. If Şengün, assuming he's there, he gets better. Maybe Giannis ends up in the Western Conference with one of those three teams. Jokic isn't going anywhere. And the Denver Nuggets as well. Eastern Conference, Pistons got a young core that can win right now and win next year. The Knicks likely can win next year. We'll see what offseason moves they make, depending on, how the playoffs end for them this year. Boston gets Tatum back. That's it. Like, if you're a Cavs fan, and a lot of this is dependent if Donovan Mitchell comes back, but if you're a Cavs fan, LeBron decides to come back, isn't there sort of an element of, let's build a team that can win right now around, obviously, the greatest Cav ever, around the hometown legend, the greatest athlete in the history of Cleveland sports with respect to late great Jim Brown. It's LeBron. Let's go for a title one last year, because there's a much clearer path doing it in Cleveland than there is anywhere else in the Western Conference. You say, well, then why doesn't he go to the Knicks? Because as much, and LeBron's talked about the mystique and the honor of playing in Madison Square Garden, it's not home. New York's not home for LeBron. It's always been Cleveland. It's why he went back in the first place. It's why after Dan Gilbert said the things that he said about this man, post-decision, to the point where Gloria James, his mother's like, you better not go back to Cleveland. LeBron James spurned his own mother to go back to the city because he's like, you know what? I've accomplished what I wanted to accomplish in Miami. I've got rings. I've already got a bunch of MVPs. I feel like almost a moral obligation to win a title for my home city. And to my heartbreak in 2016 as a Warriors fan, that's exactly what he did in dramatic fashion. Doesn't it feel fitting? He gets a retirement tour and he gets it as a Cleveland. I mean, if you think about LeBron James, a lot of things come to your mind, but if you said LeBron James, who's his NBA team? You immediately think Cleveland Cavaliers. You do. Despite, ironically, this is year 8 for him in Los Angeles. That's longer than he spent with any other organization. First stint in Cleveland was 7 years, and then Miami and the second stint in Cleveland were 4 years each. I think he's coming back next year. I really do. And I think the presser he had yesterday kind of was an illustration about, I don't think he wants to leave yet. He's still an all-star caliber player. After he came back from injury, and I think in November, he got off to that rough start. You remember the game against Toronto where the double-digit, game scoring streak ended when he, threw the assist, game-winning assist, I think, to Rui Hachimura to win the game. Once LeBron kind of got into his rhythm, he's been a different player ever since. He's looked not like prime LeBron, obviously, but like an all-star caliber guy. Somebody that can give you 23 to 27 points, 50% shooting, can give you a healthy number of assists. Bron isn't as good in the defensive end anymore. He's 41. I don't expect him to be. But he can still be a winning basketball player on a contending team. Are there teams that have a better chance of contending next year than the Cavs? Yeah, the Knicks in that conference. And I'm not ruling him out him going to New York. But it'd also be kind of weird, like, LeBron's retirement tour as a Knick? Like, that doesn't seem right. Unless it's LeBron just saying, like, I know it feels weird, but I kind of want to get ring number 5. In that case, okay, all bets are off. It would just feel right him in it in Cleveland. Here's what would also feel right for next year's All-Star game. And Steph Curry talked to the NBA and NBC crew, who, by the way, do a fantastic job. And He didn't play yesterday. He's got runner's knee. He's been out since, I think, January 30th is when he injured it against the Detroit Pistons. Hopefully, Steph should be back, I think, by Thursday against Boston. If not, worst case, probably next Sunday against the Denver Nuggets. Steph's going to be back this week. But he didn't play yesterday. Didn't want him to play as a Warriors fan. I don't want him to re-aggravate that. But he was asked point blank, are you going to do the All-Star game? Are you going to do the three-point contest next year? And Steph says, yeah, I'm doing it. I'm doing the three-point contest. In fact, he says, we're trying to get the band of the best shooters of the last decade plus together. Get Klay Thompson involved, Devin Booker, Damian Lillard, which, by the way, shout out to Damian Lillard. This man is recovering from Achilles surgery. Obviously blew his Achilles in the first round with Milwaukee last year. Goes back to Portland. This guy, his first appearance back in the Blazers jersey. He just goes out there and casually wins the three-point contest. Shout out to Damian Lillard. But get Dame involved. And I've suggested going back to technically 2 off seasons ago. And I know one of the potential participants declined this opportunity. I still think it'd be awesome. Let's do part of the three-point contest. If it needs to be its own separate event, so be it. Steph Curry and Klay Thompson get the Splash Brothers back together, taking on Sabrina Ionescu and Caitlin Clark. Or maybe if you want more pressure, Steph Curry versus Caitlin Clark. If you remember, back at the 2024 All-Star Weekend, Sabrina Ionescu almost beat, I think Steph had to hit the last shot to beat Sabrina Ionescu, who was shooting from NBA three-point range, not WNBA three-point range. We know Sabrina can shoot the you-know-what out of the basketball. Caitlin Clark even more so. Matter of fact, Caitlin, this is one of my favorite stats, Caitlin Clark's average distance shooting the basketball is deeper than Steph's. Now, like that's, and that to me is a direct result of Steph's impact on the game, Steph's impact on younger generations of basketball players, both men and women, like Caitlin Clark. You tell me that that's not must-see TV. And I've called her on the show. Their games are different. She's more of a traditional point guard who happens to be able to shoot bombs from outside, whereas Steph is kind of like a hybrid point guard who obviously is the greatest shooter ever. But I think we've been looking for the replacement for Steph, or the guy who's going to take the mantle. There's folks that thought it was going to be Damian Lillard, even though Dame's not that much younger than Steph. That Dame's great. He ain't that great. There were folks that were hoping it's Trae Young. No. Some folks think it might be Con Knipple with the way he's shooting the basketball this year as a rookie with the Charlotte Hornets. Maybe. Thus far, he's exceptionally talented, can shoot the piss out of the ball. But I think from a popularity standpoint, from an impact on the game standpoint, from a viewership standpoint, Con Knipple's not moving the needle. Trae Young's not moving the needle. Neither is Damian Lillard. Caitlin Clark is. So, and I would imagine, because listen, we know Steph is one of the most active athletes, certainly currently playing, as it pertains to uplifting women's sports. Like that's been the case. I remember years ago, I think this was like 2018, he came out with his new brand of Curry shoes. And a little girl wrote a letter, got posted on social media where I think it was basically like, hey, there's none of these shoes in girls' sizes. And Steph's like, you know what? You're right. Let's change that. That's on me. That's on Curry brand. Let's put these shoes out. Like he's always been very proactive about promoting women's sports. And so you'd have to imagine from an eyeball standpoint, from an entertainment standpoint, from a generational standpoint, Steph, Caitlin, let's see it. Don't get me wrong. A three-point contest with Steph, Klay, Booker, Dame, like kind of the old guys. Booker's not that old. Although this is year 11 for Devin Booker, which doesn't seem real. But the guys of the last 10 years who defined shooting the basketball from outside. Kevin Durant, I think Steph even mentioned. That'd be a blast. We'd all be excited for it. But could we get like a separate one? Have it on Friday night. Like Friday night is usually the celebrity all-star game, which nobody watches. The Rising Star games, which even less people watch. Have it that day. I don't know. Tell me that wouldn't be exciting. Steph versus Caitlin. That'd be a blast to watch. And so all those things being said, We're going to take a break. When we come back, it is, again, a little bit shorter episode, Carving Up Live. I did want to allow a healthy amount of space for the final segment of the show, which is, which is today's President's Day. I've been following presidential history most of my life. Let's do a quick recap of all the presidents. Feel free to stay tuned. Again, if you are not that into presidential history, American history, stand by or stick around, because I think it's going to be more fascinating than you think. That's coming up in just 1 minute on Carving Up Live. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Carving Up Live. Appreciate everybody for stopping by on a Monday. So before we get to our President's Day segment, do this every show, been doing it recently. Check out our Carving It Up merch. Scan the QR code on the top left corner of your screen to check out all of the merchandise related to Carving Up. So we got hoodies, we got t-shirts, we got coffee mugs, we got jogging shorts, we've got jogging pants. Listen, I know maybe this is just like in the southern part of the country, and maybe it's just unique to us right now, but there are meteorologists and folks talking about, hey, this is a false spring because the weather has been getting a little bit warmer here, or at least you're not just freezing your you-know-what off like we were a couple of weeks ago, or like really all of America was a couple weeks ago, except for Florida. Check out all of our merch for the upcoming spring. Again, jogging pants, jogging shorts. We got, if you want to already go ahead and get excited and get set for the summer, we got beach towels. We got all kinds of Carving Up merch on the website. So scan the QR code right there, take you to the website. It'll also show you, if you go to the regular website link on the top left of the screen, it will take you to our other Grid Network shows who have merch, such as All Even Podcast, such as Saturday Morning Tailgate, Mike and Josh, who do a great job, by the way. Mike and Josh are crushing it on their new show. We got some amazing shows, the Grid Network, so check all those out and check on the merch for those. If you just want Grid Network merchandise, you can get that too. Hats, t-shirts. I've got a Grid Network hat that I wear from time to time on the show, so definitely check all of those things out on the Grid Network website. Now, and we're going full screen because we're going to have some lower thirds for this segment. So, and I've teased it throughout today's show, but for most of my life, going back to when I was, 8, 9, 10 years old, it feels like, I remember distinctly my mom going to the dollar store. I forget how old. I was around 8, 9, 10 years old. And she bought, I should have had it on the show with me today, but a bunch of cards, like index-sized cards that had facts about each of the U.S. presidents. And it was from that moment on to now that I've been fascinated with the executive branch, with, in particular, the men who have served in that office for the last, almost 250 years. So I figured, you know what? Today's President's Day. There's not a ton going on in sports. We're in the dead period of the NFL calendar. NBA's still in their All-Star break. Baseball hasn't started and won't start for another month. March Madness a month away. Might as well. Let's just do a full segment about each of the U.S. presidents. So let's get started with, of course, the father of his country, George Washington. So a few facts about George Washington. A lot of people don't know this. This guy had to be convinced to run for president. Like, I know it's so much of his legacy, and it's deserved, by the way, is the idea that he stepped away from power. That being the first president, being revered, being the fact that he was so popular, he could have been president for the rest of his life. He could have been president until the day that he died, if he wanted to be. He stepped away after 2 terms in office. he had to be convinced to run for president in the first place. Going into 1788, 1789, people like Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Gouverneur Morris, like some of these founding fathers had to convince him. Part of the selling point was, hey, you don't have any biological kids, so we're not worried about this being like a monarchy type of situation. To when you die, you pass it to your son and so forth. And so that's part of the reason he is called the father of his country. So you've got that. He won both of his elections unanimously, which is, of course, not happened since he indisputably selected the greatest cabinet in United States history. When you talk about Edmund Randolph at Attorney General, you're talking about Thomas Jefferson at Secretary of State, Henry Knox as your Secretary of War, and of course, as we have all learned in the last decade or so, Alexander Hamilton as your Secretary of the Treasury. And so, again, you're talking about just some of the most brilliant minds of the age and by the way, John Adams was his vice president. Like some of the most brilliant founding fathers all happened to work in one administration in the early part of the Washington administration. He pledged neutrality in the impending war between England and France, which you can debate whether that was a smart decision for the United States. It eventually, we'll get to James Madison. It culminated in the War of 1812. And again, of course, he set the precedent after leaving office after 2 terms. That was ratified in the codified into the 22nd Amendment in 1951. A lot of people believe Washington is the greatest president in U.S. history. There's certainly a case for that. So that's Washington. For his successor, John Adams. So, of course, he was the first vice president in the country's history. It's odd that this is a guy who is one of the most accomplished people in the history of United States politics. When you talk about his work at the Constitutional Convention, when you talk about the fact that he signed one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, minister to Great Britain and to France, first vice president in U.S. history. Oddly enough, the highest position they held, president of the United States, was probably was the lowest point of his career. He was the least successful at that job, which in some ways makes sense because it is the most difficult job in the country, maybe even the world. But there also is an element of, man, when you're this intellect, this incredible foreign diplomat, like you think that might translate to being president. By no means was he a bad president. He was the founder of the United States Navy. Was John Adams. He steered the country from a war with France after the XYZ affair, which was basically a situation where United States diplomats were disrespected by the French, referred to as X, Y, and Z. A lot of people back in the United States wanted to go to war with France. John Adams recognized, hey, we don't have the horses, we don't have the requisite resources to go to war with a superpower like France. So he kind of saved our bacon there. The low point, though, of his administration was the Alien Sedition Acts, which basically made it a crime to criticize the government in any way, shape, or form. You could be jailed. Many people were jailed for that. And it's the biggest reason that he is the first president, or was the first president, to lose his bid for re-election, which he lost to his vice president, Thomas Jefferson, who was the first president to be a member of the Democratic Republican Party to win the office. So, again, author of the Declaration of Independence, his life away from politics has been the subject of much discussion and scrutiny in recent years. It was first exposed by the, let's just say, slanderer could be at times James Callender back in 1802. Exposed Thomas Jefferson's affair with his slave, Sally Hemings, who he had kids with. I believe they might actually have descendants to this day from that relationship. It's not entirely clear whether it was a consensual relationship or not. We're not sure about that. To me, what strikes me with Jefferson is, and this is he's not an anomaly in this, but most presidents tend to be kind of hypocritical once they get the big job. Jefferson's no different. Matter of fact, Jefferson's probably the first guy where that's the case, where he is this small government, federal government shouldn't have so much power. And then the second he becomes, president of the United States, he authorizes the Louisiana Purchase, which, by the way, and objectively just a steal. The United States doubled the size of the country, for a mere $15 million. He bought it from the French, from Napoleon, who's really just giving it away at that point because of the stuff he was dealing with overseas. And Jefferson wasn't even sure that this purchase was constitutional, if the president even had the right to make a move such as this, but he did it anyway. So the idea of Jefferson's this small government, yeah, until he became president. That was kind of the aspect of him. By the way, he and John Adams both died on July 4th, 1826, which was the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. They died literally within hours of each other. It's one of the great ironies in American history. But really, his right-hand man takes the job after him. It's James Madison. He was the father of the U.S. Constitution. He was the shortest president in U.S. history at 5 feet 4 inches tall. And he, of course, led the U.S. through the War of 1812, which, again, this seems to be a topic of controversy around some historians. Some people say, oh, the United States won the War of 1812. No, the Great Britain won the War of 1812. Guys, it was a stalemate. It was a stalemate. The British kicked our you-know-whats early in the war, and then the United States got some momentum late, most notably Andrew Jackson, Battle of New Orleans, which actually happened after, I believe it was the Treaty of Ghent was signed in the mid-1810s to end that war. That was a stalemate. The United States didn't win. Great Britain, it was a stalemate. And Madison was able to get us through that. His successor, I'm actually reading a book about him right now, James Monroe. He was the last of the founding fathers to be president of the United States. He was the last president to run unopposed in an election, which he did in 1820, mostly because of not mostly, it was almost entirely, because it was the era of good feelings. Post-War of 1812, there was a patriotic fervor that had kind of taken over the country where they saw themselves as one unified country as opposed to a collection of states. And so he's got that on his side. He's got the fact that the Federalist Party has basically kind of collapsed at this point in time. So he runs unopposed in 1820. He's well known for the Monroe Doctrine, which he actually wasn't the author of. That was his Secretary of State and his successor to President, John Quincy Adams. But it stated that Europe was not allowed to colonize any territory in the Western Hemisphere. It's been invoked by Theodore Roosevelt, by John F. Kennedy, by others. And of course, he signed the Compromise of 1820, admitted Maine as a free state, and admitted Missouri as a slave state, and was really kind of the first piece of legislation that started the process of kicking the can down the road toward the eventual start of the Civil War in 1861, where the founding fathers said, future generations will deal with the slave issue. And then those generations said, the next generation will deal with the slave issue. And eventually it comes to a point where it's not tenable for the country to even be together at all. And of course, we'll get to Lincoln, but he essentially saves the Union. Get to his successors, kind of a new age of politics with John Quincy Adams comes into the phrase. Obviously, the first son of a president to become president himself. Of course, George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush are the only duo to have that exemption. He was fluent in multiple languages. I've got written down here: English, German, Dutch, French are the ones I confirmed he was fluent in, among others. The funny thing about John Quincy Adams, not much you can say about his administration, despite the fact that he served a full 4-year term, mostly because of he wasn't similar to his father. The qualities that made him a great Secretary of State, a great diplomat, really didn't serve him that well in the presidency. It's a long story as to how he won the election of 1824. Andrew Jackson won the popular vote and got the highest percentage of votes in the Electoral College, but Andrew Jackson did not get the majority of the votes in the Electoral College. So Quincy Adams, go to the House of Representatives, who pick a winner. They pick John Quincy Adams. Andrew Jackson calls this a corrupt bargain, and the so-called Jacksonians in Congress basically block everything John Quincy Adams wants to do. So there's not much to say about his presidency. He's also the first president to be photographed. Now, this happened after he was president. It happened when he became the first president and only president to serve in the House of Representatives. He was a very ardent foe of slavery. In his 17 years in the House, he actually died in the House of Representatives in 1848. His successor, Andrew Jackson, one of the most, his legacy is one of the most divisive in history, although I would say his stock has fallen quite a bit in recent years. But Andrew Jackson is the first president from the modern Democratic Party. Now, of course, and I feel like this shouldn't have to be stated about Democrats and Republicans, the Democratic Party of Jackson of the 1820s, just like the Republican Party of Lincoln in the 1860s, not the same parties as today. Parties over a century, certainly 2 centuries, evolve and change, and certain factions may join a different party or start their own party. Like it's not as black and white as, Democrats were the same in 1829 as they are in 2026, and the same with the Republican Party. But Jackson, the thing I would argue most known for as president is signing the Indian Removal Act in 1830, which forced all Native American tribes to move west. And of course, the Cherokee tribe takes Jackson to court. They actually win. And apparently, I don't know if this is urban legend or confirmed, but Andrew Jackson says, hey, Chief Justice John Marshall made his ruling. Now let's see if he enforces it. Let's see him enforce it. And eventually, there's years of fighting. At some point, the Cherokee tribe is rounded at gunpoint and forced to move west. I think it was 1 out of every 4 Cherokee died, which is why it was called the Trail of Tears. So you have that. You've got probably the best part about Jackson's presidency is the fact that he did put his foot down during the South Carolina nullification crisis. South Carolina believed they had a right to nullify federal taxes. Jackson said, no, it's federal taxes. You got to pay them. South Carolina threatened to secede. Jackson, basically by threatening force, kind of scares South Carolina into staying in the Union. He's the first president to survive an assassination attempt, which he did, I think, during his second term. And due to a personal vendetta with Henry Clay I guess, was Clay in the Senate at that point? I know Clay was in the House and then became senator. He successfully killed the Bank of the United States, but he didn't have a substitute, which caused some problems for his successor, Martin Van Buren, who actually founded the Democratic Party. He is the first president born a U.S. citizen, and he's the first, and I think only president to not speak English as a first language. He spoke Dutch. The area of New York he was from had a Dutch background, Dutch ancestry. That was his first language before he eventually, of course, learned English. Poor management during the Panic of 1837. The term "okay," you say, "Hey, I'm going to the grocery store." Okay, that comes from Martin Van Buren, or he was called Old Kinderhook because he's from Kinderhook, New York, and Andrew Jackson. Anytime he signed a note or any piece of legislation or letter to Martin Van Buren, he would end it with "okay," and that eventually became, I think, one of the most, if not the most used word in the English language. So anytime you say "okay," you can credit Martin Van Buren. His successor, William Henry Harrison, he wasn't in office very long. He's the first president to die in office. He served only 31 days. There's a lot of debate about, the legend is he was the oldest president that time ever elected. I think he's 68 years old. He goes out, he gives us 2.5-hour inaugural speech. He gets pneumonia and dies. He was actually fine for the next 2 weeks post inaugural. It's widely believed at this point, with him and with other presidents who died around that time, that the drinking water in Washington, it was contaminated. Cholera spread like wildfire in the town of Washington, and that's likely what did kill William Henry Harrison only 31 days into office. And so his successor, John Tyler, comes in, and he is, within a year, kicked out of the party. He's basically the only president to get kicked out of his party, the Whigs, which he was in, I think, 1842. He wanted to set his own agenda, not Harrison's. That angered members of his party, and so he was kicked out. He was, after president, years later, he was elected to the Confederate States of America. In fact, I believe he's the only president to not have an American flag draped over his coffin. I know he's definitely the first and only president to have a Confederate flag draped over his coffin after he died in 1862. And what's crazy, here's a crazy fact. He died as recently as last year, 2025. John Tyler, born in 1790, had a living grandchild. Because John Tyler had, I think he had the most kids of any president, something like 15 kids or something. He had kids very late in his life. One of his kids had kids very late in life, and one of those kids, or I think 2 of them lived in the 2020s. One of them died in his late 90s last year. So, you had a president born late 18th century who in 2025 had a living grandchild. Wild stuff. James K. Polk, to me, is the most underrated president in U.S. history. I'll be honest, a part of it's my bias because he's, I think, by far the best president in the history of my home state of Tennessee. But first of all, his wife, Sarah Polk, actually began the tradition of playing Hail to the Chief, which we know today as like the theme song of the president, because James Polk was very slight, skinny, dealt with a lot of health issues throughout his life. So he was far from an imposing figure. So this was his wife's way of sort of helping assert his standing as president of the United States in public settings. He was really, the thing he's best known for is his belief in America's so-called manifest destiny, which was the idea that the country had a provincial obligation to stretch from the from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from sea to shining sea. So from East Coast to West Coast, and he settled the Oregon Territory by threatening war with Great Britain. They negotiated a deal, settled that territory. He then goes to war, kind of provokes Mexico to going to war, in the late 1840s to get to acquire Texas and a Texas border, and to acquire California. Again, he added more land, than any president in American history. So James K. Polk, highly underrated, I think, is an indisputably top 10 president. The same cannot be said for some of his successors, such as Zachary Taylor. Part of it because Taylor was only president for a year and a half. He called him old, rough, and ready. You can see his picture right there. There were times he would show up, even as president, to functions just straight up dirty. Like he was just not someone who cared that much about his outward appearance. He actually threatened, his high point of his presidency is when you had folks in the South threatening secession over the slavery issue, he threatened to hang them. Like he was like, you're not going anywhere on my watch. But he ends up dying 16 months in office. Some folks thought that he was poisoned. He ends up getting exhumed, I think 30 years ago, over 100 years after his death. And they determined that, it was probably cholera that killed him, which also killed James K. Polk. It killed William Henry Harrison. And so his successor, Taylor's successor, Millard Fillmore, he was the last president from the Whig Party to be president. He signs the Compromise of 1850, which admits California as a free state with pro-slavery measures for the South, which angered both sides. And by the way, I just have to say, shout out to my guy, Chris from Blogging Through History. He's my favorite history YouTube channel. He's pointed out, and he's 100% right about this. Look at the bottom left corner of your screen and tell me the Millard Fillmore does not look like Alec Baldwin. There's some similarities there. His successor was Franklin Pierce. So Franklin Pierce, at the time he was elected, was the youngest elected president in the United States. He had a very, very tragic life. All three kids of his kids died in childhood, including the last of which 2 months before he was sworn into office, January of 1853. Him and his wife and his son and everybody else on the train, they were in a train crash. No fatalities except for his son, who was basically decapitated in front of his parents. And Pierce, who already had alcohol issues throughout his life, it was just, as you would imagine, him and his wife, inconsolable from that point on. He was an alcoholic for most of his adult life. And he was, maybe in part because of this, he was not a very good president. He signed the Kansas-Nebraska Act in the mid-1850s. It let the new territories above the border of Kansas and Nebraska decide for themselves if they wanted to be a slave state or a free state. This ends up igniting what was called Bleeding Kansas. It was like a mini civil war in that region, and Pierce is not even renominated by the Democrats, in disgrace. His successor, James Buchanan, is regarded by most historians as the worst president in U.S. history, and you understand why. First of all, he backs the Dred Scott decision, worst decision in the history of the Supreme Court, the Dred Scott decision, which basically set the precedent and determined from a constitutional standpoint, no black person is a citizen of this country. They are property. Reaffirms that idea. Buchanan backs that. And when South Carolina secedes from the Union in the final months of his presidency, he says, hey, it's not legal for them to do this, but he says absolutely nothing to stop it. He's like, I'm leaving office in a few months. I'll let my successor deal with it. His successor, probably heard his name before, Abraham Lincoln, who in my mind is without question the greatest president in U.S. history. I could do a whole hour on this show on Lincoln. A few basic facts. First Republican president, from the modern Republican Party. He's the first with a beard, which I love. And he's the tallest president, still to this day, at 6 feet 4 inches tall. Of course, we all know he wore the hat, which made him look even taller. People get in heated debates nowadays, like, Lincoln, there's the famous quote where he says, prior to the Civil War, if I could end the Civil War, bring the South back in the Union. This is a loose quote. Bring the South back in the Union without freeing a single slave. I would do that. If I could do it by freeing some and leaving others in bondage, I would do that too. Lincoln, it's well documented, his entire life was vehemently against slavery, had nothing but more outrage about it. He believed it was an evil institution, but believed as a pragmatic politician, he did not have the necessary political momentum or capital at that particular moment to end slavery on a dime. By the way, he wasn't allowed to end slavery until, of course, the Civil War starts. Then with his wartime powers as commander-in-chief, administers the Emancipation Proclamation. Eventually, that gets codified into the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery. And of course, there's the iconic Gettysburg Address in November of 1863, in which he talks about how at the very end of the speech, government of, by, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. It basically reaffirms the Declaration of Independence. His second inaugural was reelected in 1864. Second inaugural is one of the greatest speeches any president or any American, in my opinion, has ever given. There's the iconic line when he talks about, because at this point, the North is going to win the Civil War. It's all but guaranteed. And many of those in his party, there were the so-called radical Republicans, wanted to punish the South, wanted to, excommunicate the South, wanted nothing to do with the South. And Lincoln comes out in his inaugural. And one of the most iconic part of this, he says, quote, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations." If you read the whole speech, it is as great a speech as any president's ever had. Of course, tragically, a month later, he became the first president to be assassinated at Ford's Theater by John Wilkes Booth. And as a result of that, his successor, Andrew Johnson, comes to the White House. And I sometimes joke that Andrew Johnson is the reason that no president has come from the state of Tennessee since then in the last 160 years. So listen, there's a case Andrew Johnson might be the worst president in U.S. history because of how badly he not just bungled the Reconstruction issue, how he was, got to realize, he was from a different party than Lincoln. The only reason he was on the ticket with Lincoln in 1864 was because he was the only senator from a seceding state, Tennessee, to stay in the Union. Now, East Tennessee tended to be a very pro-Union part of the South. That did not necessarily mean they were pro-abolition. Andrew Johnson was someone who you could put in that category. And listen, he was inflexible, stubborn. He vetoed, I think, 29 pieces of legislation, which was not broken until FDR, who served 4 terms in the mid 20th century. He's the first president to ever be impeached. Kind of flimsy allegations. He violated the Tenure of Office Act. That's another story for another day. He ends up surviving removal of office by a single vote, 2/3 of the Senate. For those who don't know, House votes to impeach. The Senate, 2/3 of the Senate have to vote to, to charge you with high crimes and misdemeanors and remove you from office. Johnson survives by 1 vote and, of course, is not reelected. Ulysses S. Grant is his successor. He's the first president, actually, who was sworn in with both parents alive. He was the youngest president elected in history at that point. He's obviously the hero of the Civil War, the hero of Appomattox for the North. He actually appointed African Americans to offices in the federal government, which was a very bold move for that particular moment in time. He was also somebody who fought very, very hard against the Ku Klux Klan, which rose up in the South in the late 1860s, early 1870s, in some ways surpassed the legal powers of the president. I shouldn't say that. Congress gave him the right to do it, but went above and beyond to get rid of the Klan from those areas, even hold them without trial. Second term kind of falls apart. There's scandals within his administration. And I'll say this, I don't know if any president's legacy has improved in the last 20 years as much as he has. And I'm glad to see it because by all accounts, great character, believed in the advancement of civil rights for Black Americans. He was the first president to win an election in which the Black man was given the right to vote. So Ulysses S. Grant is someone I have a lot of respect for. Rutherford B. Hayes was his successor. He wins the controversial election of 1876. Through the Compromise of 1877, gains the White House. Again, there were a few states in dispute between him and the Democratic challenger, Samuel J. Tilden. And due to what was the so-called Compromise of 1877, it was believed that the Republicans would agree to pull federal troops out of the South if Democrats would allow Hayes to win the White House. Now, Hayes represented a faction of the Republicans that, because I guess he recognized that Reconstruction was becoming less and less popular, he's like, I want to pull them out of the South anyway. Well, he does, and that clears the way for for segregation and for Jim Crow laws to run wild on the South for basically the next century. And so Hayes has been vilified for that decision, and rightfully so. His successor, James Garfield, to me is the biggest what-if president in United States history. He was only in office for 6 months. He was really only doing the job of president for 4 months before he was shot in July of 1881. There's a whole shout out to Candace Millar. We've reached out to her. I'd love to have her on the show. Her book, Destiny of the Republic, was recently made into a docuseries on Netflix, Death by Lightning. Could not recommend it more. It's fantastic to watch and very historically accurate about the assassination of Garfield. But this is somebody who could write Greek with one hand and Latin with the other simultaneously. Like this guy was brilliant. And so he's the ultimate rags to riches story, becomes president, wasn't even looking for the nomination in 1880, but because of a series of concessions and compromises, he ends up being the nominee, wins the election. He's assassinated by a so-called office seeker, Charles Guiteau, who was out of his bleeping mind. Garfield probably survives his wounds if doctors believed in germs at that time and don't kill him themselves. And he, again, dies in September of 1881. His successor, Chester Arthur, was put on the ticket in large part because of this compromise to make Garfield the Republican nominee in 1880. Chester Arthur comes from this faction of the Republican Party called the Stalwarts. And essentially, they were the corrupt wing of the party. Roscoe Conkling was a senator who was kind of the head of this whole deal. Chester Arthur was his right-hand man. And one of the great ironies in American political history, Arthur becomes president, and in an era where people are clamoring and are demanding changes to civil service reform and to the spoil system, Chester Arthur, who is a product of the spoil system, actually ends it by signing the Pendleton Act in 1883. And so Arthur, to me, is by no means a great president, but far better than I think a lot of people at that time expected him to be. His successor, Grover Cleveland, actually was the first president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. He was the 22nd and the 24th president. Donald Trump has since become the second president to have that distinction. But listen, in his personal life, he married a woman named Frances Folsom in the first year or so of his administration. Got to keep this in mind. Grover Cleveland's in his mid to late 40s at this point in time. Frances Folsom is a recent college grad. He knew her when she was an infant because she was her father was a friend of Grover Cleveland. And so a little creepy to say the very least, but still they ended up, I guess, by all accounts, having a happy marriage. One thing that was increasingly unpopular, Grover Cleveland was a Democrat, but he was very much, that was around the time when you did have some small government Democrats in the late 19th century. He was opposed to pensions for Civil War veterans, which cost him in the election of 1888, which he loses to Benjamin Harrison. We'll get to in just a second. And again, first president to be elected 2 non-consecutive terms. Benjamin Harrison is his first successor in between 1889 and 1893. Not a ton to say about him. He's the only grandson of a president to become president. He was William Henry Harrison's grandson. He signs the McKinley Tariff, which is a disaster for the economy, ends up leading to the Panic of 1893 when Grover Cleveland comes back in office. By and large, not that great of a president. He was the first president to be in office during a $1 billion Congress. William McKinley is Grover Cleveland's second successor. He's in office from 1897 into 1901. He gets America involved in the Spanish-American War to acquire territories such as Guam, Puerto Rico, the Philippines. And a lot of this was based on the idea that, hey, a lot of these European countries are colonizing some of these parts of the world, and that if the U.S. didn't catch up, if the U.S. didn't take such measures, that there's potential they could be overpowered. And so William McKinley was the last president to be a veteran of the Civil War. He was very hesitant to go to war with Spain. He does. U.S. wins easily, so we take those territories, and they've been with the United States ever since. He is tragically assassinated early in his second term, September of 1901, by an anarchist in Buffalo, New York. He dies 6 days later. And his successor is none other than Theodore Roosevelt, who, in my mind, is the third greatest president in history behind Lincoln and Washington. Theodore Roosevelt, when you talk about the first of all, the character that this guy is, you're talking about just the ultimate, pardon my French, badass. Yeah, that's who this guy was. There's a famous story where, and I hope I'm getting the facts right, he's on a fishing trip. His boat gets stolen. he builds a boat to go after the guy who stole his, and then gets his boat, arrests the guy, takes this guy to custody, brings him back. Like, this guy, you do not mess with Theodore Roosevelt. But this is somebody who believed implicitly in the idea that the president should be in service to the American people. He was, I would argue, few presidents in the history, Lincoln, his distant cousin FDR, among others, Jackson, Jefferson, expanded the powers, of the president. His kind of maxim that he believed in was, if the Constitution doesn't say I can't do it, then I guess I can do it. If it doesn't say I can't, that gives me the green light to be able to do this. He took on monopolies, JP Morgan in particular, early in his administration. He's able to successfully defeat his monopoly on the Western Railway system. You talk about the Pure Food and Drug Act, which makes food safer for Americans. He did so much for social problems in that particular time. The conditions for so many laborers were just unacceptable in every way, shape, and form. He signed pieces of legislation to address that. Theodore Roosevelt's a legend. He is, post-Lincoln, to me, he's the greatest president that we've ever had. His successor, William Howard Taft. It's hard not to love William Howard Taft. So he's unfortunately the heaviest president that we've ever had in office. I think he got up to like 350 pounds. He ended up, after becoming president, serving as Chief Justice on the Supreme Court, which is the job that he really wanted, but because Theodore Roosevelt pressured him into doing it, because he wanted Taft to continue his agenda. His wife, Helen Taft, really wanted to be First Lady, so he kind of felt all these forces pressuring him to run for president. He does it. He hates the job, of course, and he ends up running for re-election in 1912, really just because he's kind of reversing some of Theodore Roosevelt's initiatives, because Taft is more conservative than Roosevelt, and Theodore Roosevelt is bullying him, calling him names, basically calling him an idiot, and Taft ends up running for re-election and comes in third behind Theodore Roosevelt, who runs as a third-party candidate, and Woodrow Wilson, his successor, who wins the election. So I'll be honest, folks, Woodrow Wilson's maybe my least favorite president in U.S. history for a number of reasons. I think he is one of the most overrated presidents in U.S. history, and his recent rankings as years have gone by have reflected that. Listen, he obviously, he did begin the Federal Reserve. He, funny enough, campaigned in 1916 when he ran for re-election. He said, we're not going to, the United States is not going to join World War I. Immediately after being sworn in to his second term, United States gets involved in World War I. He was a horrible racist. The first movie ever shown in the history of the White House was a silent film called Birth of a Nation, which was a pro-KKK film that Wilson praised afterwards. So he was awful. He fired black people, barred them from federal jobs, from jobs in the federal government. Like, this guy was as racist as it got. He didn't actively back this piece of legislation, but he certainly did nothing to stop it. I believe it's the Sedition Acts. Was it the Sedition Acts? Yeah, the Sedition Act and Sedition Espionage Acts of 1918, which was very similar to the Alien and Sedition Acts by John Adams, which made it a crime to criticize the government during wartime. He's big on this idea of the League of Nations. He's unwilling to compromise with Republicans like Henry Cabot Lodge in the Senate, and it ends up falling through in large part because Wilson had a stroke. With a year and a half left of his presidency, a lot of folks believe that his wife, Edith Wilson, was kind of like the first female president in U.S. history, because she was relaying important matters of state to Wilson. She was kind of doing more heavy lifting than he was, because he was physically unable to do so. And so that's kind of a fun fact for American history, but not a fan of Woodrow Wilson, to say the very least. Warren G. Harding, can't say I'm crazy about him either. So he touts a return to normalcy. He wants to institute more of a laid-back conservative agenda. He hired a lot of cronies, a lot of corrupt individuals, into his administration. Ends up at 2.5 years into his term dying of a heart attack. There were folks that thought his wife had poisoned him. I believe his wife didn't allow them to do an autopsy, which was kind of weird. She actually died a year later, so I guess we're not able to find out from her perspective. But it was believed that he didn't have any children. As recently as 10 years ago, some DNA testing was done, and it found out that he had had an affair with a woman named Nan Britton, who he had a child with. And so he did technically have kids, and that was found out literally a decade ago through DNA testing. One of the most corrupt presidents, one of the most unqualified presidents, somebody who didn't really care that much about the job, stayed up late at night in the White House gambling with his subordinates, who some of them went to prison for their involvement in the Teapot Dome scandal. Warren G. Harding was not a very good president. Calvin Coolidge, though, was his successor. Calvin Coolidge, I would argue, is probably the model prior to Reagan of the modern conservative movement. Government should do less, cut taxes, the whole bit. A lot of his economic policies failed to anticipate the impending Great Depression, which would come months after he left office in 1929, which is something, again, a lot of it was he hired a lot of very wealthy people to be a part of his cabinet, such as Andrew Millen. And I think he was like the third richest man in the country. Like there was not that proactive element of seeing what could come ahead. So Calvin Coolidge, I'm not crazy about him. Folks who are may believe differently than me politically are. He's kind of in that mid to upper tier president for me. His successor, Herbert Hoover, God bless him. It's not his fault the Great Depression started. There's no question about that. It is his fault how he dealt with the Depression. He believed in this idea of voluntarism, that big corporations would voluntarily, help those who are in need because of the Depression. And he actually has a quote. Herbert Hoover was the first millionaire to be president. But there's a famous quote where he talks about capitalism. He said, the only problem with capitalism are capitalists. They're too damn greedy. And a lot of his lack of charisma, his lack of, public speaking ability really, really hurt him his time in office. And especially when you're running for re-election against Franklin Roosevelt, you're dead in the water. And so his handling of depression left much to be desired. Franklin D. Roosevelt, though, often regarded as a top 5 president. Some have him as high as number 3. Listen, this is somebody who was, again, he served more years than anybody in the history of the office. In fact, 6 years after his 1945 death, they end up making it law, putting it in the Constitution where you can only run for 2 terms. But listen, this is somebody who signed multiple pieces of legislation in a place that didn't really deal with the Depression that much, but we're thankful are here today, such as Social Security. For example, his leadership, with the exception, of course, of the internment of Japanese Americans, which was the worst thing he ever did as president by far after Pearl Harbor. Aside from that, disastrous failure. His leadership during World War II, D-Day, all of it was superb with the Allies, Winston Churchill and Stalin. Like FDR's a top 5 president, indisputably. He's maybe the greatest orator to ever be president. His fireside chats are very well known. It was estimated over half the country would listen to his fireside chats on the radio. Even when things weren't going that well in the country, he had this ability to instill confidence and belief that tomorrow was going to be better than today. FDR, one of the greatest leaders that have ever been president, certainly one of the most progressive. Franklin Roosevelt was the 32nd president. His successor, Harry S. Truman. I like Truman. I really do. This is somebody who comes into office and immediately he comes in, after 3 months of being in the vice president job. Roosevelt dies. Truman comes in. Truman is told, hey, we've got an atomic bomb that can end the war. Germany surrenders not long after Truman takes office, but Japan is still a very real threat. And Truman, and it's controversial to this day, but decides, okay, we're going to drop the bomb. And it ends the war. Japan surrenders. Again, it's estimated. I tend to be somebody who understands Truman making that move from the perspective of he has to look out for Americans first in this war. It was estimated 500,000 Americans were going to die if the war continued. And so he said, to protect the homeland, I'm going to make this difficult decision. The best thing Truman ever did to me was the Marshall Plan. Puts that into place. It sends foreign aid to rebuild Europe, in part to avoid the spread of communism in that region, but to also rebuild certain parts of, or many parts of Europe post-war. And it's the reason that countries like Germany are allies to the United States to this day. He ends up winning re-election I guess it was re-election because he served most of Roosevelt's 4th term In 1948, there's a famous picture of him holding the newspaper. Dewey defeats Truman. Thomas Dewey was his Republican challenger. He thought he had the election in the bag. Truman also, by the way, desegregated the military in an election year, which was a very bold move to make. I give him major props for that. I'm a fan of Harry Truman, to say the very least. Dwight Eisenhower is someone else who's in that elite pantheon of presidents. He's somebody who takes over. He ends the Korean War almost immediately after taking office. He was one of the most beloved Americans, maybe of all time, certainly the 20th century, because of his efforts during World War II. But second term, there's the the Soviets launched Sputnik, which is the first satellite into space. There's this belief in the United States, like, oh my God, the Soviet Union have an advantage over us in the missile war, in the space race, so to speak. His last speech in office, his farewell address, most iconic farewell address outside of George Washington. And he talks about the fact that we must guard against the military-industrial complex, and basically this idea of going to war unnecessarily. And that has aged quite well today. His successor, John F. Kennedy, one of the most iconic presidents in United States history, is in office for the fabled 1,000 days. There's the Camelot aspect to it. Kennedy's the youngest man ever elected president. I believe 42, 43 years old, out of Massachusetts. He comes from this powerful Democratic dynasty of the Kennedy family. His father worked for FDR. Obviously, his brother, Robert Kennedy, ends up working in his administration, and before he himself was assassinated in 1968, is a candidate for president. But for as bad as his failure at the Bay of Pigs was in 1961, I think Kennedy's handling in 1962 of the Cuban Missile Crisis is one of the high points in American presidential history. There are folks in the Kennedy administration that would tell historians in recent years, we were that close to going into nuclear war. And Kennedy, he resists the urge to drop missiles on the Soviet Union, to attack the Soviets, resists what the generals are telling him, chooses the conciliatory route, ends up the missiles getting removed from Cuba, and he saves the United States and maybe the world in that instance. Of course, he's tragically assassinated in Dallas in 1963, and to this day, there are still conspiracy theories about the events of that day. His successor, Lyndon Johnson, he comes in, he signs, he talks about the new freedom, new policies that he wants to put in place. You're talking about Voting Rights Act, Medicaid, federal aid for education, environmental protection laws, consumer protection laws, and of course, most notably, the Civil Rights Act in the mid-1960s. His handling of the Vietnam War in the late 1960s is why he did not run for re-election in 1969. That's why Richard Nixon, who loses the hotly contested election of 1960, loses the gubernatorial race in California in 1962, looks like his career is over, and then the events of Johnson's second term, or really one full term as president, prompts him to run in 1968. Again, his relations and his dealing with China during his first term was masterful foreign policy. He ends up getting elected. He wins 49 of 50 states in the election of 1972. 2.5 years later, he resigns from office due to the Watergate scandal, due to the fact that, and he didn't have to cover it up, but Nixon was very paranoid, had a lot of shady business behind the scenes. He and Henry Kissinger, his national security advisor, he is the first and to this point only president to resign from office. His successor, Gerald Ford, comes in, and Gerald Ford to me is one of the better character guys to be in office. He's the best athlete. It is to me so unfair that Chevy Chase in Saturday Night Live in the mid to late 70s portray him as just this bumbling, just falling over the place just because he tripped and fell on, at the airport one time off a plane. Gerald Ford was drafted in the NFL out of Michigan. This guy was a great athlete. And by the way, was one of our longest lived presidents at age 93. And if you've seen pictures the last year of his life, he still looks fantastic. But listen, he pardons Nixon early in his administration. It's very controversial. The war of Vietnam ends in Saigon. And there's this lack of credibility that the United States feels like it has. So that's why they go to a true outsider such as Jimmy Carter, who was, I think it's fair to say, at best an average president, probably in that lower half tier, maybe the best human being to ever be president. Jimmy Carter, we know about his 4-decade retirement, him and his, God rest his soul, Jimmy Carter and his late wife, Rosalind, what they did with Habitat for Humanity. He ends up winning the Nobel Peace Prize in 2002. He ends up presiding over an era of disastrous inflation, stagflation it was called, ends up getting destroyed in the election of 1980 by Ronald Reagan, who's president from 81 to 89. And again, the modern conservative movement is spurred by Ronald Reagan. In some ways, I think it is positive in the sense that, hey, you're patriotic, we love America. In other ways, and we're going to turn a blind eye to issues such as homelessness, such as AIDS, such as many of his failed economic policies, which would hurt his successor, George H.W. Bush. But to me, Reagan's greatest gift, he's called the great communicator for a reason, is his ability to know exactly what to say at the moment to say it. After the Challenger disaster in the mid-'80s, his speech after that is a tearjerker to this day. His handling of the end of the Cold War was masterful foreign policy. Reagan, to me, is in that top 15. I don't have him quite as high as others, but I think he's indisputably a top 15 president in U.S. history. His successor, George H.W. Bush, is, to me, the best one-term president outside of James K. Polk. When you talk about how he helped handle, kind of took the baton from Reagan and ending the Cold War, there was obviously the campaign pledge, read my lips, no new taxes. The current economic times at that point forced him to raise taxes. He says, you know what? I'm going to work with Democrats on the other side. He was very, very much somebody who ran things based on consensus, who wanted to work with the other side. He was very much a moderate Republican, which is why Reagan put him on the ticket, because Reagan was much more conservative. Then you have the Gulf War, which the United States is able to win in the early 1990s. He ends up losing re-election to Bill Clinton, who is one of the more slick and gifted politicians of the modern age. You talk about the fact that we had a balanced budget under Clinton. There's, of course, the scandal with Monica Lewinsky that leads to him being the second president in history to be impeached in 1999. And of course, I tend to have Clinton in that, again, that top 15 area president. Thought his handling of the economy was better than most. I think his efforts overseas as it relates to the conflicts in the Middle East, I thought were well-intentioned, left more to be desired. His efforts at home as it relates to healthcare, I think were ahead of their time, and a future president, I think, would be able to take that baton. His successor is George W. Bush. So W was the first president, who was in office when I was born in 2003. Of course, immediately right off the bat, you have the terrorist attacks of September 11th in New York City and all over the country, East Coast. So I thought his initial handling of 9/11, there's a reason he had an approval rating of 90%. There's the iconic speech on Ground Zero. He says, I can hear you and the rest of the world hears you. The people that knock these buildings down will hear all this soon. It gives me goosebumps to this day. And of course, United States goes into the war with Afghanistan. Then we go into war with Iraq, which we know to this day should have never happened. And by the way, there were Democrats, Joe Biden, Hillary Clinton, who voted to go to war with Iraq. So this was not just a Republican issue. This was by and large somewhat bipartisan. And so that to me is that, along with how he handles Katrina and how he handles the recession of 2008, are the low points of his presidency. I do think, though, his handling of 9/11 was off the charts. Bush, to me, is in that above average president tier. You got Barack Obama, who talked about him earlier in the show. He was on, he was at the All-Star game last night in Los Angeles. Barack Obama comes in office. He inherits the financial crisis of 2008. Of course, he's the first black president to ever be elected. He's somebody who runs a very youthful campaign, the hopeful campaign. Yes, we can. And I actually heard him on a podcast talking recently about how, and I think he's right, Democrats need to get out of this preachy, virtue signaling sort of way of communicating to voters and get back to the joyful, hopeful, optimistic way of going back things. He obviously signs the Affordable Care Act into law, which many on the right were against. Now voters in red states were like, hey, don't take my Obamacare subsidies. I thought his handling of the tragedy at Sandy Hook Elementary in 2012 and the shooting in South Carolina at the Church of South Carolina in 2015, again, very kind of similar to Reagan. How he handled crisis was masterful. He knew exactly what to say at the moment to say it. His introduction of drone strikes overseas, I think, was certainly more of a negative than a positive, to say the very least. It's probably the biggest knock that I would have on the Obama administration. Over time, in a second term, the politics kind of where they had kind of gotten to a point where they are today, where it's very polarizing, very divisive. Other side won't work with you just by virtue of you being in the other party. A lot of executive orders that Obama had to sign into legislation, wasn't able to work with Congress. His successor was the current president, Donald Trump, 45th and 47th president of the United States. Obviously, you have in his term from 2017 to 2021, he inherits a solid Obama economy, is able to manage that. COVID hits, economy plummets. That's the only thing Trump really had to brag about. He handles the COVID crisis, I think, disastrously as it pertains to the misinformation that he can continue to spew on a consistent basis from the White House press room, on social media. Even more harmful is when he loses the 2020 election to Joe Biden. He, and even to this day, promotes false claims of a stolen election, despite the fact we literally haven't an ounce of evidence to prove it. And then, of course, he gets reelected, or I guess now a year and a half ago in 2024 over Kamala Harris. And he's the current president right now. We've talked about Trump at length on this show. Those segments speak for themselves. And finally, Joe Biden, 46th president from 2021 to 2025. He is, along with Trump both times, the oldest president ever elected in office. Not so fun fact, we have never had anybody older than a baby boomer elected to president since 1993. Feels like we probably need to change that at some point. But listen, there's obviously the controversy with how he handled the open border, the pull out of Afghanistan, which was inevitable, which was going to happen, but certainly could have been managed better. I think his foresight as it relates to wanting to regulate tech companies as it pertains to AI is something that will age well as time goes on. Biden, to me, it's a little too early to tell. He's only been out of office for a year. I would put Joe Biden probably in that mid-tier of presidents. You could convince me one or the other, positively or negatively. But again, it's not been that long since he left office. It's hard to judge him from a historical context because we got to see what Trump does the rest of the way and what Trump's successor does to really rate Joe Biden. Okay, so I know that ended up being a longer segment than people might have thought it would. But listen, I think, in many ways, the story of America can be told through the presidency, in my view. I think, again, just from the personalities of the presidents, the circumstances that presidents either inherited or caused are something that has always fascinated me throughout my life. And again, we actually did a series, me and shouts to my good friend Isaac Lawson, we did a series, can't believe it's been this long, 4 years ago in 2022, the Carving It Up U.S. Presidents Edition. Feel free to check that out on the YouTube channel. And yeah, it's, again, I've been into presidential history longer than I've been into sports. And I know that may shock some people. It's the God's honest truth. And so, again, long segment. We'll put it on YouTube. Hope you guys enjoyed that sort of recap of all the United States presidential history from Washington to the modern times. And with that, that is all the time we have for today's show. Appreciate everybody stopping by. As always, be sure to catch Carving Up Live on Wednesday at 6 p.m. Eastern, 3 p.m. Pacific time, right here on YouTube, as well as on Twitter, on X. Twitter is X. It's Twitter. Instagram as well. You got Twitch and you got Facebook as well. Be back on Wednesday to talk pretenders and contenders in the NBA, as well as any other story, circling around sports and otherwise. Hope everybody has a great week. Please stay safe out there. God bless y'all. Peace out. I'm telling you, Polk's an underrated president. Thanks so much for watching the show on YouTube, and be sure to go click that big red subscribe button and check out the other clips and full shows from Carving It Up Live, as well as our other incredible content creators here on the Grid Network.